With the first question to John. John, can you tell us what are the 3 attributes of an innovative culture?
I think, first of all, you have to have an insatiable curiosity. If you're not curious, you're going to miss a lot, because if you want to build an entrepreneurial company, the only reason for an entrepreneurial company to exist is to do something that hasn't been done well by someone else before. And so you've got to be able to observe things. Second of all, you've got to have a great passion and believe in something. And the third thing is you've got to solve a really big customer problem. If you aren't solving a problem for a customer, then there's probably no economic model to go along with your passion and your curiosity.
Doug?
Well, I don't know about 3 attributes, but I always look to the Picasso model, where like as an artist, he kept blowing up his whole thing every 5 years. And it's something to do with creativity and innovation, how that works. And I think companies, particularly once they get fat and super successful, the tendency is to protect the cash cow. And I think a company, to maintain innovation, has to, as they develop that cash cow, prepare to kill it. You have to kill your babies at the same time and have that attitude that somebody out there sees that cash cow and finds the vulnerability. That's the moment you're most vulnerable. So I think an innovative culture has to start with what John said. It has to have a cause. It has to have passion. And that might just be the founder that builds around that person. And then I think they have to figure out this counterintuitive thing of blowing themselves up, which is painful and hard, and people create entrenched turfs. Look at the story of Xerox and how they passed on Adobe and Apple. You would have had Adobe and Apple be in Xerox, but they didn't want to change their thinking. So it's hard.
So John, you've had a lot of exposure to Apple. What is the biggest lesson you walked away with after running Apple for a decade?
I think it has to be the first principles that Steve created. And between 1982 and 1985, I was probably the closest person on the planet to Steve. He didn't have many friends. He didn't believe he had time for friendships. And he had, as Doug so well explained in his presentation, just this driving need to make a difference in the world, to change the world. So I'd say the thing that I learned from Steve was he always had first principles. One first principle was that he wanted to build technology for non-technical people. He wanted them to be able to do creative things. The second is that he wanted to create technology that had no compromises. He believed that the design of the product, the design of the experience was something that was even more important than the technology that enabled it. And so when he created the Apple logo, he insisted that it be printed in 6 colors. Well, nobody could see 6 colors. We could see 4 colors from a printing standpoint, but Steve insisted it would be six colors, just because he wanted it to be perfect. I remember when the first Mac shipped, one of the engineers came to Steve, and it was a lockbox product, the first Mac. You couldn't get into it. You needed a special tool. And Steve wanted a final rev on the motherboard. And the engineer said, "Steve, we're going to miss the ship date. Why are you going to do this? Nobody's going to know." And Steve said, "I'll know." And that was Steve Jobs. So he had these first principles, no compromises, great user experience, build technology for non-technical people, sell to the people who love us. And look at Apple today. They follow those same principles.
What do you think of Tim Cook?
I think Tim Cook has been an extraordinary CEO. Fabulous example of how you can hand off from one leader to another. And a leader who didn't try to emulate Steve. They aren't really much alike in terms of their talents. But Tim Cook is able to handle complexity. He's built an extraordinary management team around him. He runs the world's most valuable company. And so I have great respect for what Tim Cook has accomplished.
Doug, you documented Apple for many, many years, and you worked closely with Steve Jobs as well. What lesson did you learn after all those years?
If you look back, all of the people that made some of the greatest breakthroughs were truly idealistic. It's something you can't put in a business plan. I think the logical financial approach is to create a structure and a plan, but you have to have, I think, this idealism and this passion and this cause. That's like the first thing, because ultimately, that's where the money is. That's where you make the most money, by being the most idealistic. It's counterintuitive. But if you believe you're going to improve the world, you'll work harder, you'll try harder. But think about John Warnock, you know, Steve, of course, but you think about John Warnock, think about Gordon Moore or Doug Engelbart. You know, these people were passionate, they were obsessed, and they wanted to improve lives, and their products ultimately were transformational. So I think the lesson is you have to have what I said earlier. But I also think that, you know, failure in Steve's mind is just a speed bump. It's not terminal. You got to be willing to keep going and it's just a speed bump on your way to ultimate success.
And to your point, we've had a conversation, and in previous weeks, you talked about how it is important to fail.
Yes. Well, they talk about it a lot in Silicon Valley. But I mean, it's like, oh, it's great, we fail. But I think I'm trying to turn the dial a little bit differently and say, yes, it's traumatic, it's horrible, but if you have the mindset that Steve had, it didn't even happen. It didn't even happen, you just keep going. I think that's it. It's really simple. But you have to believe in something.
Some things are difficult to do as a CEO and to keep a thriving work environment. John, can you walk us through what happened leading up to Steve Jobs' dismissal?
I think the best way to explain it is to understand the backstory of why was I recruited to Apple in the first place? I didn't know anything about computers. I was a consumer marketing veteran from the Cola Wars. And I remember when I was explaining to Steve, because he didn't know anything about marketing at that time, turned out he ended up being perhaps the greatest marketer ever. But this was back in 1982. And he said, you were outsold by Coca-Cola 10-1 in 50% of the US. And it was the most valuable brand in the world at that time. How did you end up beating Coca-Cola in the Cola Wars? And I said, well, Steve, I said, Coke was reality. They had far more resources than we did. But perception leads reality. So we had to own perception. And so we created things like the Pepsi Challenge and the 2-liter plastic bottle and many other things. And Steve said, I get it. He said, nobody in Silicon Valley thinks that computers are going to be for non-technical people. They believe everything is about, Moore's law, bits, bytes, hardware. And he said, you've got to come and teach me about consumer marketing, because I'm creating the most incredible experience product. I used to call it experience marketing. I'm going to create the most important experience product. So that's why Steve wanted me. The board wanted me because Apple had introduced the Apple III and it had failed. The Apple II was 6 years old, and that's a long time in a high-tech product. It's lifetime. And they were just introducing Lisa, and there were expectations it wasn't going to do that well, and it failed. So the board said, Steve's building this new product called Macintosh. We're still over a year away from it coming to market, and it won't make any money for probably several years after that. The only cash flow in the company left is the Apple II. We need someone who can come in and turn around the aging Apple II and keep the cash flow flowing. So I was brought in not to create the Mac. I had nothing to do with creating the Macintosh. I was brought in for two purposes. One was to turn around the Apple II, which we did, and it became increasingly profitable and funded Apple until 1986, when Apple eventually could make money from the Mac. And the second thing was to help Apple learn how to do experience marketing. Where the breakdown came was in 1985, as Doug pointed out. And the Macintosh Office, which was the first time that Steve used a laser printer and used a Macintosh together in what we eventually renamed as desktop publishing, and it didn't work. Moore's Law had nothing to do with Apple, had nothing to do with Steve's brilliance. It just didn't work. We used to call it the Steve Jobs reality distortion effect. So Steve never let the laws of physics get in the way of his vision. And so he was absolutely determined that this was the future, and he was right. He was almost always right, but his timing was wrong. And so he turned on me and he said, "It's your fault, John. You made me price the Mac too high. We've got to move the marketing from the Apple II to the Macintosh Office." And I said, "Steve, if we do that, we're a public company, we'll bankrupt the company, and we can't do that without going to the board." We went to the board, and the board was a very experienced board. The lead investor on the board was a man named Arthur Rock, who was legendary in Silicon Valley. He was probably, at that time, the most successful venture capitalist. And he listened to me, and then he listened to, and the whole board did to Steve, and then they turned to the third co-founder of Apple, Mike Markkula, and they said, Mike was the vice chairman at that point, and he said, "Will you go talk to the rest of the key members of the organization and come back and report to the board, not to Steve, not to me?" And so Mike Markkula came back a week later, reported in closed session to the board, and the board said, "We agree with John, we don't agree with Steve." Shortly before I had joined Apple, Steve had been dismissed from the Lisa team. He was actually working on Lisa before he worked on Mac. And Arthur Rock said, "Steve, we gave you your chance, when we dismissed you from Lisa. We let you take over Jeff Rashkin's project, which was called Macintosh. And you're too disruptive. You've got to step down from running the Macintosh division." Steve was never fired. He later resigned and went off and started Next about 5 months later. But the reality is that perception leads reality. The perception was that I fired Steve Jobs. If I look at it in hindsight, I feel really, really bad because I didn't understand, coming from East Coast corporate America, the uniqueness of a founder. Founders should always be given more latitude than professional executives. And there could have been a way, because Steve and I were, up to that moment, very close friends. I mean, we were together all the time, 7 days a week. And the breakup was emotional for him, and it was emotional for me. And there could clearly, in my sense, looking back in hindsight, been a solution to that, without forcing Steve to leave the company. And I think the company would have been a better company if he'd stayed.
Doug, you look like you're dying to say something.
No, I just remember John talking to me about this a couple of years ago. You were saying you wish that the board and you guys had been more mature to find a way. It's that duality. Like, how do you keep that chaos close and still grow? I think that's one of the most interesting challenges today for any innovative company.
Well, rarely do you see one person running a company all by themselves.
Right.
And even when you see one person at the top, like a Jeff Bezos, there's always, one or two other key people around them. Whether it's Paul Allen or Bill Gates, or whether it's Andy Grove and Gordon Moore, or whether it's Larry Page and Sergey Brin, or Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, there's always a team at the top, and we should have figured it out. We didn't. And I feel really badly.
The other thing that I wanted to comment on is the reality distortion field. Steve was famous for that, and it was like a trait that not only Steve had, but a lot of the great innovators that I met, almost all of them had this almost willful denial of reality. It was almost this crazy optimism, and it got them through, but they were always living as if it was already a done deal. Like John said, it was Moore's Law. The Mac the chip wasn't powerful enough to support the graphics. But in Steve's mind, it was already done. It was already, can't you see how brilliant this is?
Well, the interesting thing was when Steve started Next, again, Steve was the best recruiter ever. There was no one better than Steve Jobs at recruiting
100
talent.
interviews for every person he hired.
And
Really?
he was the best negotiator, as you heard that great story with Canon and Steve. But Steve went and made the same mistake over again at Next that he had made with the Macintosh. What did he do? He got ahead of the curve on what he thought the next machine could do, and it couldn't deliver.
5 or 6 new
And he
technologies.
beat me up for pricing the Mac at $24.95. So what did he do on the next machine? He priced it at $10,000.
Crazy.
So
For higher ed. Oops.
So no question, Steve was a genius. I mean, everywhere I go in the world, people are still fascinated by Steve, and he's been dead since October 5th, 2011. So he did make the dent in the universe and deserves every bit of acclaim he gets. But the reality is that he did live in a different reality from the rest of us. And it wasn't that different from other geniuses like him.
No.
So how does one manage the creative genius founder who creates all this chaos?
Well, I'm a lot wiser now than I was back in those early days for me in Silicon Valley. And I'm still very actively involved in a whole bunch of different things. Have nothing to do with computers per se, but have to do with big data analytics, health tech, fintech, regenerative medicine, things of that sort. And there's some incredibly talented individuals who are running these startup companies that I'm investing in and mentoring these CEOs. And you just have to have a respect for entrepreneurs. That Doug said it so well. These are people who live on the edge. Innovation doesn't happen in the center of a domain. It happens on the edge where domains come together and touch. It's called connecting the dots. Steve used to call it zooming. Zoom out, connect the dots, zoom in, and simplify. And so you've got to have a tolerance for respect and the risk-taking that they're willing to take, that you learn more from your mistakes than you do from your successes. If anything, you become a victim of your success when you're too successful. And entrepreneurs are different. And the best have this unique extra sense where they're just intuitively able to see things. And if we don't give them room to be able to try and experiment and make mistakes, and their personalities may not be perfect all the time, then you're going to miss these genius moments. And there will be more geniuses like Steve Jobs in the future.
So who's living on the edge? Who's the next Steve Jobs?
Elon.
Well, I'll give you an interesting story, how I think about it. There are few people that I can observe that have some of the characteristics of a Steve Jobs. Elon Musk would come to mind, where they look at an industry and they see it in a different way. One of my favorite mentors at MIT Media Lab was Marvin Minsky, who's one of the founders of artificial intelligence. And he used to say to us, he'd say, you don't really understand something really well unless you understand it more than one way. And that was the genius that Steve Jobs had. He could see something that the rest of us didn't see. And I used to sort of paraphrase, and I'd say that the genius is being able to see things that are going to be obvious 20 years later. Whatever Apple has created is completely obvious to us today, but it wasn't obvious when Steve was creating a lot of this. Well, take something as simple as digital photography. And if you think about what Kodak created was the archiving of photos. The Kodak moment was something special. So people wanted to make photos to keep a record of their memories. And yet, when a man named Evan Siegel started Snapchat, he saw digital photos in an entirely different way. He said, it's not about memories, it's about communications. And he said that young people in particular Now that they have smartphones and they can send photos over 3G and the quality is pretty good and they can create them instantly, he said they really want to use them to communicate. And he came up with the brilliant ideas, why don't we make the photos disappear in 30 seconds? And people of my generation said, well, that's a stupid idea.
Yeah, I can't.
Why would you make a photo and send it to somebody and have it disappear in 30 seconds?
I worked so hard on that photo.
Well, if you're a teenager, you say, hey, that's really cool. I can do some outrageous things, and there's no footprints to follow. That little instinct, that sort of extra observation of seeing something that the rest of us don't see. Steve Jobs had it, Elon Musk has it, even Siegel has it, and a few others have it. And in the case of Snapchat, they turned down reportedly $3 billion to be acquired by Facebook, and they're now getting ready for a $40 billion IPO.
Right.
So the one thing you discover when you go to Silicon Valley, so many people show up, they were valedictorians in their class, they say, I'm pretty smart, I got a job here, and then they discover everybody was a valedictorian. Everybody's smart.
That's right.
So just being smart, that's just a commodity. So it's those who are just willing to work incredibly hard, never give up, ever, who are insatiably curious. But then there are just a few that have that extra instinct. They're able to look at the same evidence and see it in a different way. And that's what it's all about.
But I also noticed at Next, as I said, he did 100 interviews for every one they hired. His receptionist was a Harvard-trained urban planner. Seriously. Everyone in that building was like incredibly talented. But he didn't have the management chops that he thought he had, as you know. So people would complain to me that like he was micromanaging everything. So you had all these brilliant people and not a lot of them able to really use that talent. So that's another challenge of how you take that whole organism and make it
But the amazing
productive.
thing that Steve did learn, I mean, Steve Jobs
right.
2.0
Right.
Was very different than Steve Jobs 1.0.
He had
Steve
to go
Jobs
through that.
2.0 actually turned into probably the greatest CEO ever, and his management skills turned out to be exceptional.
It's like the Jungian journey. It's a hero's journey, or Campbell.
Doug, who's the next Steve Jobs? You said it's going to be a woman.
Well, I don't know. I was hoping Elizabeth Holmes was going to do it.
A Theranos.
I don't know. I have a list of people, but there is to me, Elon Musk really fits a lot of the profile of that. He's crazy, obviously. He's taking huge risks. But what I love about Elon is I really like big thinkers that are long-term. They see down the road, and they're willing, and he's obviously clearly a fighter. He's taking huge chances, but he's also improving the world, so he's a good candidate. I don't know, it's like innovation. We don't know it's innovative until 20 years later, according to Paul Sefo.
Well, here's the interesting thing. So I used to say genius is someone who can create the obvious 20 years before the rest of us. But I was just recently over in Tokyo with Ray Kurzweil, who some of you may know or know of in the artificial intelligence world. And he and I were giving speeches there, and we were chatting afterwards. And Ray has come up with this law that he calls the law of accelerating returns, which is essentially that we intuitively are linear thinkers by instinct. And if you look at Kodak in 2007, Kodak, who had invented the digital camera, who was the world's largest printer of digital photos, was in a market battle with Walgreens for the single-use camera. So in 2007, they doubled down on their investment in silver halide film processing.
Oops.
At the same time, Steve Jobs was taking the iPod, put a phone chip in it, and increased the screen size, and called it the iPhone.
Wow.
Kodak knew that digital photography was coming. They were smart people, but they didn't think it was going to happen anytime soon because they were living in linear time. Maybe 5-6 years it would eventually, roll out. But the world was then starting to move in exponential time. Exponential means a logarithmic scale. Moore's law, exponential. And so 3 years later, 2010, $20 billion Kodak files for bankruptcy. 3 years later, Apple rules the world with iPhones. Well, we're living in exponential times. So I would modify when I said, genius is seeing the obvious 20 years ahead. Genius is seeing the obvious 3 years ahead. Things are changing that fast. And we haven't yet adapted to that yet. We see businesses that didn't exist a few years ago, like Slack, and then all of a sudden, here it is, like it's always been there. In June of this year, nobody on the planet had ever heard of something called Pokemon Go. 30 days later, in the middle of July, on one day, more people were following Pokemon Go than Twitter.
Right.
I think this is a perfect example of the wave idea, because what I see, what you're talking about is this is a maturation of all these nascent technologies that came out of the 80s and 90s or the 70s. And we're at this cycle where we're at the end of this wave because the stack is getting integrated and you can put together these different technologies and they actually work. Yeah. And the products are getting better. So I think that's why we're going to see this acceleration as we go into the next wave, because there's so much stuff just laying out there ready to be grabbed and put together, like Lego blocks.
So I never focus that much on the technologies. I always look at the derivative effects, and then you try to look at them in some context. One of the derivative effects of these multiple exponential technologies is that technology is commoditizing at such an accelerating rate, so that if you're only betting on the technology, you're probably going to lose, because it's going to be a commodity. And therefore, you say, so what is sustainable? And the only thing that's sustainable, in my opinion, is domain expertise. And so you start to look at the different domains that are just beginning to scratch the surface, just beginning to be touched by some of these exponential technologies. And remember, it's going to happen in exponential time. It's not going to happen in linear time. So we're going to wake up 3 years from now, and there are companies we didn't even know of that are going to be wild successes. And they're not going to be out in social media and in e-commerce and delivering goods to our home in 2 hours. That was yesterday. Perfectly decent businesses, but that was yesterday. It's going to be in things that are big established industries. Financial services would be a key one. Healthcare is another one. The industrial internet, which GE, Cisco, Intel, and others are focused on, with the era of sensors. These big established industries are going to get disintermediated, and it's going to happen so fast, and you're going to see more Kodak stories out there over the next few years, and people are going to say, I don't know how it happened so fast.
And you're involved in a couple of biotech and fintech companies.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, first I'll talk about health tech. I've been in health tech for 10 years. I got into health tech because I'm still inspired by one of the first meetings I ever had with Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, and it was at the Mac Engineering Labs several months after I joined Apple. And we're sitting around, and Bill and Steve are talking about their noble cause and how they're going to change the world, giving people tools for the mind. And I'm sitting there saying, noble cause? I've never heard of those words before in business. Remember, I'm a veteran of marketing gladiatorial combat, Coke versus Pepsi in the Cola Wars. And as I understood it and have had the time to internalize it over the years, I say, yeah, it's all about noble cause. And so I decided about 10 years ago that I wanted to focus on the noble cause of health tech. Why? Because we have an unsustainable healthcare system. And I come at it with 3 vectors: consumer, high tech, and now some domain expertise in healthcare. So one of the companies we started, I'm on about my 4th health tech company. We started in 2013. It's called RX Advance. We launched our first service in January of this year. It's a platform with actionable analytics that touch a lot of the $840 billion RX ecosystem, pharmaceuticals and everything that happens with the supply chain of pharmaceuticals and everything that happens with medication therapy management, avoidable drugs, specialty drugs, and so forth. We launched this service in January of this year. In our first year, we'll do $65 million of revenue, and we'll be break even. But that's not the story. The story is we already have a book of business of over $1 billion for 2017, and we'll be very profitable, we believe. And we're already pro formaing 2020, and we think we'll be about 14 billion revenue. You say, well, how is that possible? You know, that's ridiculous, but it's not ridiculous. Because when you go into these really big industries and you can disintermediate them and solve really big problems and do it in ways that haven't been done before, it's not that impossible at all. So I'm also in fintech. And last week I was giving one of the keynotes at Money 2020, and we were launching for the first time our fintech company that had been in stealth, and it's called Lantern Credit. Very simple idea. We focus on the credit score, but a credit score measures somebody's credit worthiness, and it's very hard to improve your credit score. In fact, the resolution dispute process can take months and months, and it's frustrating, and you're dealing with call centers and IVR systems and things of that sort. Well, we've been able to work with the credit bureaus and FICO and other people in that ecosystem and say, we can build on what you've already got. And we're going to bring in our actionable analytics, which involves a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And we now have an instant, incredible, and intelligent credit score that enables us to focus on the middle income people. If you have a 640 credit score and you want to purchase a big ticket item, say dental implants or a new car, $25,000 purchase, you'll pay about 20% APR. If you had a 740 credit score, that would probably drop to about 10%. So if you could unlock the credit capacity and reduce the credit expense for middle income people, that's almost like a raise for a lot of people who haven't gotten a raise, by the way, for the last 20 years. You know, 80% of people who apply for a credit card on Credit Karma, Credit Sesame, FreeCreditReport.com, these are basically lead gen businesses for credit cards for banks, they get denied. When you get a denial, your credit score goes down. And so we've now built this platform. We have licensed in technology from Caltech and JPL, which complements our machine learning with their artificial intelligence. And so we're now out building for the big banks who are getting into robo-advisory services, an added capability to be able to take what is described as the data exhaust. The data exhaust is that about 1% of the data that could be useful for fintech is actually used in a useful way. That means 99% isn't. Just add 1 more percent and you double the usage of data. So whether you're using unstructured analytics or whether you're using machine learning or whether you're using true artificial intelligence, and the ability to fundamentally change industries and enable incumbents to do things that just weren't possible before. All of that's realistic today.
I have a couple of more questions before opening up to our audience. What excites you both most about the future of technology? Obviously, John, you're definitely
I looked at it 2 ways. First of all, I've been an entrepreneur longer than I ever ran a corporation. And I ran 2 corporations. And so I live in the world of entrepreneurs. And I don't run these companies anymore. So I'm an investor and I'm co-founder in many of them. And I'm a second pair of trusted eyes. And I'm a rainmaker. And I do lots of things. But I don't actually run the companies day to day. So I can be involved in more than one at the same time. So I get to see things from a different perspective. What motivates me are 2 things. One is I travel around the world and I speak at various technical universities, and I am just so impressed with the quality of talent that there is around the world.
Yeah.
There's so many talented people. And I look at what those of us were doing back in the 80s in Silicon Valley, and I look at the talent that I meet, and the energy and the passion and the willingness to take risk, and it's all there. And it isn't just in this country, it's all over. So that makes me an optimist. And I spend a lot of my time saying, how do I do a handoff? Because I'm kind of the last of my generation still doing what I do. And so there has to be a handoff of what did we learn that we can hand off to the next generation. Because we didn't have mentors when we were there. Doug, you remember, we were kind of on our own. We were flying without a wire, without a net.
And we're told it couldn't be done.
Yeah. So how can we hand off to the next generation is really important to me. The second thing is that I've never seen anything like this in my entire life, this era of accelerating returns, where there are so many things there's nothing that's not impossible. CRISPR-Cas9, and editing genes and proteomics and epigenetics. I'm in regenerative medicine and what we can do with placenta-based stem cells that are coming from the blood cord, not the germline, and how we can go in and actually regenerate tissues and slow down aging, and what we can do in all different areas of health tech that I haven't even taken you through. And there are just so many interesting things that are possible to do today. And guess what? Even for someone my age, fortunately, it's not happening in linear time. It's happening in exponential time, and I'm going to get to see it.
Doug?
I'm a romantic, and that's why I'm just a sucker for everything John says. It's like, it's going to be great. And I'm so glad you're doing the health tech and the fintech thing, because, for me, my experience was going out in the world and documenting most of my early career, the hard, bad things that were happening. So what I learned is war bad, famine bad, drugs bad. I'm really excited about how technology can enable and how people can leverage technology to improve their lives. And what's happening right now in Africa is so exciting to me, and all over the world. But you see people creating these incredible leapfrog solutions in Nairobi and Kenya and South Africa, where you have just a whole explosion of entrepreneurs, and they're going to take this new technologies and do things we're not even thinking about, I predict, over there. So that's exciting to me to watch that happen and watch lives improve that way, and especially around education, which I learned quite young is the key to almost every social issue. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I like about what you're saying about fintech and what I've heard here is that everything is related. So, you could talk about the 1%, the 99%, but everything is related. Quality of life for the masses has to rise, or the quality of life for the highest level is going to suffer at some point. You can only live in a gated community so long. You got to go out into the world at some point. You can't be under armed guard all the time. We have to raise the middle class. We have to create jobs. We have to figure that out. And technology is going to be the answer. And it doesn't mean that robots are going to take jobs. There's going to be some new solution that technology will bring to create other jobs.
So the exponential technology is not about elevating everybody to luxury. It's about, we now have the possibilities to solve problems like 3 billion people go to bed every night without shelter. Another 3 billion people, probably some of the same, don't have potable water. They're living off of water that they shouldn't be drinking, and about 600,000 babies die each year from that. And so there are incredibly big problems. The Gates Foundation is totally focused on eliminating malaria, and they believe that they will. Mark Zuckerberg and his wife said that they are setting up a fund of $3 billion to eradicate disease in the lifetime of their daughter. So I mean, you say, well, these are ridiculous ambitions that can't possibly be fulfilled, but maybe they can. And so that's the kind of world we live in today, which is even more exciting than the world that Doug and I experienced back in the early days of Silicon Valley.
Stuff's coming we can't even imagine. It's going to be amazing.
I'm going to open it up to the floor. Any questions out there?
So, with humans needing their phones on a daily basis, and you were talking about tissue regeneration, do you think the theory of singularization is far off?
Singularity?
Yes.
Well, I was with Ray Kurzweil, as I said, about a week and a half ago in Tokyo, and he was talking about singularity. So singularity, I think everybody knows, is when machines reach the point where they may actually be more intelligent than humans. And Ray, who keeps these very detailed projections, says that by 2030, we will hit the point of singularity. And he says by 2045, that we will be beyond singularity, because that's when there'll be a mind meld between machines and humans, and we'll get a new species. So it's your bet whether we'll do it. I don't expect to be around for the 2045, but maybe I'll stretch out to the 2030. And Ray is a true genius. I mean, he is just an exceptionally brilliant person, so I take what he says seriously. But it's not what I wake up thinking about every day. My job is to explain this stuff and to put it into pragmatic terms and say, okay, so what can we actually do in a realistic period of time, over the next 3 years, 4 years. And so that's how I get involved in things like AI. Well, it's pretty clear in that context. Guess what? AI is the next operating system. It's the next OS. And it's that fundamental. It's bigger than the internet. And will the internet even look like the internet anymore? Remember, the internet was designed as ARPANET for DARPA, and no one ever thought about security. It was never designed for that. So the things that are going to happen over the next 15 years, whether it's blockchain, which is clearly going to happen, being able to take the entire ledger and being able to move it with the transaction for counterparty trade, absolutely real. And nobody even knew what blockchain was 3 years ago. All these things are the pragmatic explainer, people like me, we believe it. This stuff's happening right now in exponential time. The singularity stuff, I haven't a clue.
I think with the singularity, there are a lot of people who disagree with that, like Mitch Kapoor or Bill Joy. Bill Joy, I talked with him about this, and he said it's never going to happen because Moore's law has been stalled out. But maybe quantum computing, or there'll be other offsets, or John was telling me about other solutions for that, parallel processing, whatever. But for me, it's not so much whether he gets to the singular or we get to the singularity. It's on the way to that, really cool stuff can happen. And like this third species thing, what I think of when I hear that is, oh, you mean I could get a chip and put in my brain to improve my memory? That, sign me up. You're already a cyborg because you can't let go of your phone. You're already man and machine. So I think on the way to singularity, we're going to find really, really cool stuff that will improve lives and make.
Yeah, it's often the unexpected consequences that are more important than what the original.
And Ray says that too. Even though I spent a day arguing with him, but he finally said, "I can't talk to you anymore. You don't have a PhD."
But the thing that the thing that fascinated me, I wish I'd seen these graphs that Ray had some years ago. He was showing me what he had created back in 1992, that projected Moore's law going forward all the way up to the present. And he said, now look, you could see that it was obvious that someone was going to be able to create a mobile device, around the mid-2000s that would be able to do what the iPhone did. But they couldn't do it, 3 or 4 years earlier. The technology wasn't ready. It was obvious that someone around the 2007, 8 timeframe was going to create the ability for people to be connected to people over smartphones. But he said, I couldn't have predicted that it would be called Facebook, but it was obvious these things were going to happen. And I was sitting there saying, wow, I wish I was smart enough to have seen what he was predicting, because then I would have understood, Facebook sooner, or some of these other innovations. Well, so I then said, well, so what are you predicting now? And it's quite clear that fintech is just wide open. Here's a little interesting, I like little factoids. 1950s, the share of profit in the US from the banking system was 5%. In 30 years ago, about the time that we were getting close to the Berlin Wall going down and the beginning of globalization, the share of profit for the US banking system, of all profits in the US, corporate profits, was 10%. So we've gone from 5% to 10% in that period of time. The share of profits, of corporate profits today, 30 years later, is 30% for banking. You say, so what happened? Well, obviously the Berlin Wall went down, globalization started, somebody had to fund the expansion capital for globalization, the banking system. Then process automation became possible in the 1990s, the internet became commercial, and we started to get into new types of data products like derivatives and much of the shadow banking world. And so the banking system exploded with growth. And now we're here at this point. Yes, we went through a recession. Yes, we've got Basel III and all these new regs, Dodd-Frank and CFPB and so forth. But the reality is that there's a way to take this big, complicated, fee-generated industry, highly regulated, and begin to think about it in a different way. And it can take two vectors. One vector is a bunch of startup companies and say, we're an alternative to the banks. The other vector is to say, no, wait a minute, we can enable the banks to think about banking in a different way that's more lightly regulated. And so both of those vectors are happening. So the innovation that's going to take place in fintech is just going to be spectacular over the next 3 to 4 years in exponential time.
We have time for one more. Sarah, Mike? Oh. She's coming.
So what do you think the social impacts are, particularly to jobs, having a son go through the application process for high school? And yes, in San Francisco, it's as onerous as getting into college. The schools talk about you can't expect to go through school, go through college, and have a job waiting for you, that you need to be an educational entrepreneur or a cultural entrepreneur. So what should young people study? What should young people do to prepare for the world that you're describing?
Well, I think, first of all, the STEM movement, sometimes called STEAM as well, science, technology, art, and math, is really important. And the curriculum of our K-12 system is just ridiculous. I mean, it has no relevance to anything that anyone really needs to know. In the world ahead. But here's the more interesting question. As we move, if AI is the next OS, believe me, it is. So if AI is the next OS and all the derivatives of that in terms of what it can mean to literally reinvent industries in exponential time, the estimation that I've seen by a number of people, including McKinsey & Company, is that about 60% of the jobs that will exist then, skilled jobs, haven't been invented yet. And a lot of the jobs that we think of as skilled jobs, not the muscle jobs, the robots already took over a lot of those, the brain jobs, the middle management jobs, those jobs are going to rapidly disappear. So, for example, what does machine learning do really well? The first example of that was what we saw with Deep Blue and Garry Kasparov when Deep Blue beat him in chess. And machine learning says, look, the machines can learn from the machines, and they can get smarter and do pattern matching, and do it relatively rapidly, like look at 1 million chess moves in a second and make a better decision than the world champion chess player can. That's not artificial intelligence. That's pattern matching. With machines learning from machines. Artificial intelligence is when you can actually go in and reason. But let's just stay with the machine learning before we even get out to the AI. Think about pathology, think about radiology, think about lawyers, think about accountants, think about dermatologists. Most of what they do can be better done by machine learning. Rapid pattern matching. So the large majority of manufacturing jobs, as we knew them, they didn't go to Mexico or China. They went to the microchip. And the same thing is going to happen with a lot of the skilled jobs that we take for granted today. There'll still be lawyers and doctors and accountants, but we don't need as many of them, and they'll do different things. In some cases, the machines will assist them. In other cases, the machines will replace them. So then you go back and say, so what should a young person be learning? The one thing we know for certain, whatever they're learning today will be almost useless. When I went to school, I think when most of you went to school too, the focus was to learn the answers. We were measured on answers. If we got an answer from someone else, we were cheating. But now, the answers are all for free. You go to Wikipedia, you go to Google, it's free. Nobody charges for the answers anymore. So what do you got to know? You got to know the questions. It's all about knowing how to articulate smart questions. And so we should really be teaching young people. It's not so much you have to learn a particular discipline or skill, but because you're going to have many different jobs, careers over your lifetime. But you've got to learn how to ask the right questions. You've got to learn how to think, with critical thinking skills. Well, we had to learn that in Silicon Valley back in the 80s. There was no one to teach us. That's why you saw so many people drop out of college, and start companies. Colleges weren't teaching any of this stuff. And so I don't know what the answer is for education, but I know that it has little to do with answers. It has everything to do with preparing people with critical thinking skills. And a good step along the way is certainly STEM or STEAM.
I think that last point is really, STEAM is really critical. I think that one of the hottest resumes now I've heard in Silicon Valley several times is a liberal arts degree. And I think John Maeda at MIT said we have to put arts back into STEM. I mean, STEM is critical. And according to the federal government, the two fastest growing areas of job creation right now is engineering and coding, programming. So that's what they could study if they want to get a job out of college. But I think what's happening is it has to be interdisciplinary. People have to look at culture is going to survive, right? So we have to assume we're going to have culture. Languages, arts, all of that stuff, and the sciences have to be merged. We've completely downplayed the arts and music and all those things in America, and it's to our detriment. I mean, there's so many studies showing that the arts, music particularly, improves math scores. So why have we done that? That's just this crazy wrong emphasis. So I think education has to be about individuals figuring out their own interdisciplinary programs that will give them a range of skills in different areas that relate to culture, but more than that, the ability to think. We have to know that we know nothing and take the critical thinking skills to the highest degree, because that's going to be useful in every single industry.
Yeah. Well, if you think of art and music, and you break them down to a hardcore, they're basically about doing creative things with symbols. And so it could be graphic symbols, it could be audible symbols. Well, what is math? One of the most exciting areas of math today is symbolic regression. If you're into Monte Carlo game theory or Bayesian statistical modeling or Markov chain analysis, these are all symbolic levels of math. Math is an abstraction. I've been an advisor to DARPA on what's called biology is technology. When I went to school, biology was chemistry. Guess what it is today? It's information science. And that's why I get so excited about what's going on with things like CRISPR-Cas9, which is the ability to edit genomes, and getting involved with regenerative medicine and what you can do. All of these things are about the power of mathematics, the symbolics, that you can do. So if you're a young person and you don't have the curiosity for this stuff, I don't care whether you can write Python or whether you can do it. That's almost immaterial, whether you can code or not. Because, by the way, the machines will be talking to the machines. They don't really need coders that much anymore. But the more important thing is you've got to have that curiosity of these things that are going on around you. We haven't had anything like this since the early industrial age. This is much bigger than anything Doug and I experienced back in Silicon Valley in the 1980s. And if you are a young person without the curiosity to observe, you don't have to be an expert in these things, but if you aren't curious about this sort of stuff, it's going to be a brutal shock to you out there, because there just aren't going to be jobs that are going to give you a quality of life if you aren't able to adapt to a very, very different economy than what you're being prepared for in school today.
That was enlightening and inspiring. Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Doug.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So if I could ask you to